On the morning of September 14, 2009, a woman named Susan Day walked into a therapist's office in Portland, Oregon, and said something that her therapist would later write about in a case study read by thousands of mental health professionals around the world. She said, "I think I imagined all of it. I think I made myself crazy." She wasn't mentally ill. She had no history of delusion. She was a former hospital administrator with 2 graduate degrees, a woman described by everyone who knew her as one of the most grounded, competent, clear-headed people in any room she entered. And she had just emerged from a 4-year relationship that had systematically dismantled everything she believed about herself, about reality, and about her own mind. What happened to Susan is documented. It is studied. It is, according to researchers in the field of coercive control and personality disorders, not an exception. It is a pattern, and the fact that it happened to someone exactly like her, someone strong, someone capable, someone who prided herself on her psychological awareness, is not a coincidence. It is, as you will understand before this narration ends, the entire point. The question most people ask when they hear stories like Susan's is, how does someone intelligent end up there? The better question, the one that actually protects you, is, why do people like Susan get targeted in the first place? That question has a documented, research-backed, deeply uncomfortable answer. And that is exactly what we explore here at Mind Cage. By the time you finish listening, you will be able to identify the specific qualities that make certain people primary targets for narcissistic individuals. You will understand the documented psychological mechanics of how the targeting works, why strength does not protect you and in many cases makes you more vulnerable, and what the earliest signals look like, not the obvious ones everyone talks about, but the ones that appear before you would ever think to be cautious. This is not a list of warning signs to paste on your refrigerator. This is the architecture of something most people never understand until they are already inside it. To understand why narcissists target the strongest people, you have to start where the research actually starts, not with the narcissist, but with what draws them. And for that, you have to understand what a narcissist actually needs. The clinical definition of narcissistic personality disorder, as outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is precise. It describes a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy that begins in early adulthood. But the DSM definition, accurate as it is, misses something that researchers like Dr. Craig Malkin at Harvard Medical School have spent years documenting: the profound, almost bottomless psychological need that drives narcissistic behavior. Malkin, in his work on narcissistic spectrum disorders, describes what he calls the addiction to feeling special. This is not metaphorical. The need for validation in narcissistic individuals functions neurologically in ways that parallel substance dependency. They require a consistent, high-quality source of what researchers call narcissistic supply: admiration, attention, status, and emotional reaction from others, and not just any others. Here is where the research becomes important. In 2016, Dr. Jennifer Freyd at the University of Oregon, building on her earlier work on betrayal trauma, published findings that identified a pattern in who narcissistic individuals pursue in both romantic and professional contexts. What the data showed was not random. The targets were not chosen because they were weak, naive, or emotionally damaged, the popular assumption that persists in mainstream discussion of narcissism. The targets were chosen because they possessed a specific combination of qualities that made them exceptionally valuable as a source of supply. Those qualities were high empathy, high competence, strong personal identity, emotional resilience, and this is the part most people never hear, a tendency towards self-reliance and self-accountability. In other words, the people most likely to be targeted were the people least likely to believe they could be targeted. Think about what that means for a moment. the strength that makes you confident in your own judgment is the same strength that makes you valuable to someone who wants to destabilize that judgment. The empathy that makes you an extraordinary friend, partner, or colleague is the same empathy that can be leveraged against you. The resilience that helps you endure difficulty is the same resilience that a narcissistic individual can exploit to push further, demand more, cross lines they could not cross with someone less durable. This is not theory. This is documented behavior observed across hundreds of clinical cases and survivor accounts, studied by researchers at institutions from Cambridge to Stanford to the Australian Institute of Family Studies. The pattern is consistent enough that some researchers have given it a specific name. Dr. Lundy Bancroft, whose work with abusive men produced one of the most cited bodies of research in coercive control, calls it the selection process. And that name is deliberate. It is not accidental. It is not random chemistry. It is a process. To understand how the process works in practice, you need to understand the full arc of what happened to one person. Not a composite, not a fictionalized account, a documented case. In 2003, a woman named Andrea, her surname withheld by the researcher who published her case, Dr. Case, Sandra Holt at the University of Toronto, but her details otherwise specific and verified, was a 31-year-old emergency room nurse working in a mid-sized hospital in Ontario. She had been described by her supervisors as exceptionally capable under pressure. She was known among colleagues for her composure during crisis situations, her willingness to take on the most difficult cases, and her ability to remain calm when everyone around her was losing control. She had a wide social network, a stable apartment, savings, and what she later described as a clear sense of who she was and what she valued. She had been in 2 previous relationships, both of which had ended amicably. She had no significant trauma history. She was, by every external and internal measure, a grounded, capable adult woman who trusted her own perception of the world. In October of 2003, she met a man at a professional networking event for healthcare workers. His name was Marcus. He was 42, a pharmaceutical sales representative with an easy manner, a quick intelligence, and a way of paying attention that Andrea would later describe as unlike anything she had experienced before. In the first conversation they had, which lasted almost 2 hours at the edge of a hotel ballroom while the event wound down around them, he asked her questions that no one had ever asked her. Not surface questions. Questions about what drew her to emergency medicine specifically, what she found meaningful about the work, what she thought the systemic failures in hospital management actually cost patients over time. He remembered everything she said. When he contacted her 3 days later, he referenced specific things she had mentioned, specific ideas she had expressed. He made her feel seen in a way that she described, in her clinical interviews 7 years later, as almost overwhelming. This is the first stage, and understanding it requires resisting the impulse to dismiss it as simple flattery. What Marcus was doing in those early weeks was not random charm. It was identification and mapping. Researchers who study the early stages of coercive relationships describe a process in which the narcissistic individual rapidly collects information about their target's values, wounds, needs, and self-concept. Not because they are conscious they're running a strategy in those early moments, but because their need for supply drives them toward exactly the kind of information that will allow them to present themselves as the ideal match. Dr. George Simon, whose work on character disturbance has been foundational in this field, describes this as the mirroring phase. The narcissist reflects back to the target an image of the person the target most wants to be seen as. For Andrea, a woman who prided herself on depth, on serious engagement with ideas, on professional competence, Marcus became a mirror that showed her exactly those qualities validated and cherished. Within 6 weeks, they were in an exclusive relationship. Within 3 months, he had told her he loved her. Within 6 months, he told her he had never felt this way before, that she was unlike anyone he had known, that he believed they were, and this is the word he used as documented in Andrea's clinical notes, fated. The intensity of the early stage serves a function beyond making the target feel loved. It creates a baseline, a very high emotional baseline, because what comes next is the slow, nearly imperceptible withdrawal of that intensity, and the target's subsequent behavior will be shaped by the need to return to the baseline. This is the mechanism that researchers like Dr. Natri, Patricia Evans and Dr. Robin Stern describe as intermittent reinforcement, and it is neurologically one of the most powerful conditioning tools that exists. The unpredictability of reward in human relationships activates the same dopamine pathways that make slot machines compelling. The target does not become attached to the person. They become attached to the hope of returning to the version of the person they first encountered. And because that version was designed specifically to match what they most deeply wanted, the attachment is extraordinarily difficult to break. By month 7 of Andrea's relationship with Marcus, the first shift had occurred. It was small enough that she almost dismissed it. He cancelled plans at the last minute, something he had never done before. When she expressed disappointment, his response was not apologetic. It was a gentle suggestion that she had high expectations, that she needed a lot of reassurance, that perhaps she had some anxiety she hadn't fully worked through. This is the moment that Dr. Maus Holt identifies in her case study as the pivot point. Because Andrea, being a thoughtful, self-aware person who took her own psychological health seriously, did what a thoughtful, self-aware person does. She considered the possibility that he was right. She reflected on it. She asked herself whether she was being unreasonable. This is the precise mechanism that makes strong, self-reflected people more vulnerable, not less. The willingness to examine yourself, which is a marker of psychological maturity, is also the door through which doubt enters. A less reflective person might have simply dismissed his comment. Andrea turned it inward. She began watching her own reactions more carefully, measuring them against an invisible standard of reasonableness that Marcus had introduced and that she had, without realizing it, adopted. Over the following months, this pattern repeated and expanded. Each time Andrea expressed a need, an opinion, or a concern, it was gently reframed as a character flaw, not aggressively, not cruelly, calmly, and with the kind of measured, intellectual language that was consistent with how Marcus presented himself, and that resonated with how Andrea thought about the world. Her directness became bluntness. Her high standards became perfectionism. Her emotional expressiveness became instability. Her professional confidence became arrogance. None of these reframings arrived as accusations. They arrived as observations, as concern, as things he noticed because he cared about her growth. By the end of the first year, Andrea had begun, without noticing that she had begun, to see herself through his framing. She was spending mental energy managing his perception of her, rather than trusting her own perception of herself. She was pre-editing her words before she spoke them, to avoid triggering his quiet disappointment. She was working harder than she had ever worked in any relationship to maintain something that had felt, at the beginning, effortless. The professional dimension of this case is particularly documented, because Marcus's campaign, and Dr. Holt uses that word deliberately in her case study, did not remain confined to the private relationship. By year 2, he had begun introducing narratives about her to her own social network. Not lies, something more sophisticated. Selective emphases, reframed stories, presented with genuine concern. To her closest friend, he expressed worry about whether Andrea was handling the stress of her job. To her sister, he mentioned that Andrea sometimes said things without thinking, and that he hoped she knew how she came across. To colleagues who appeared at social events, he would describe her with a warm smile as someone who had extremely high standards for the people around her. Each of these statements was deniable. Each was positioned as affection. Each planted a seed of doubt in people who loved her, so that when she eventually began to describe what was happening inside the relationship, she found that the people she turned to had already been given a framework through which to hear her words as evidence of the very character flaws Marcus had identified. This is what researchers call the isolation through delegitimization process. The target does not need to be physically isolated. Their account of their own experience only needs to be made suspect in the minds of the people who might otherwise believe them. It is one of the most sophisticated features of coercive control, and it is most effective when deployed against someone whose relationships are wide, strong, and important to them, because there is more social territory to colonize. If you have ever told someone about something that was happening in a relationship and been met with a version of, "Are you sure you're not being a little sensitive?" it is worth asking who introduced that framework to them and when. By year 3, Andrea had reduced her social engagement significantly, not because Marcus demanded it, because she had internalized enough of his framing that being around other people had begun to feel like an opportunity for her flaws to be exposed. The confidence that had been her most consistent trait for her entire adult life had been replaced by a hypervigilance about how she was perceived. She was still functioning professionally, still showing up, still performing at a high level in the emergency room, still being relied upon by colleagues and supervisors because professional competence was the one area of her identity that Marcus had not fully colonized. But she was running on fumes. The cognitive load of managing her own image in the relationship, combined with the constant low-grade anxiety of unpredictable emotional withdrawal, was enormous. In year 3, Marcus began what Dr. Holt describes as the comparative diminishment phase. This is where a new person entered the picture, not necessarily a romantic rival, though that was implied with enough ambiguity to be destabilizing. A female colleague of Marcus's who appeared at events, who was mentioned in conversation with quiet frequency, and who was invariably described in terms that contrasted with the qualities Marcus had identified in Andrea as deficiencies. This person was easygoing. This person didn't take things so seriously. This person laughed at herself. The message was never stated. It did not need to be. Andrea received it with perfect clarity. The function of this phase is to reactivate the pursuit behavior that the original idealization had established. The target who has been conditioned to seek approval through the return to the original baseline of adoration now understands, at a level below conscious articulation, that there is competition for the prize she has already been working to deserve. The result is an intensification of effort, an even deeper subordination of her own needs and perceptions to the project of being found acceptable. It is a trap with no exit within the logic of the relationship itself, and this is where the first pattern becomes absolutely clear across the documented research. The targets of narcissistic selection are not made vulnerable by their weaknesses. They are made vulnerable by the deployment of their strengths against them. Andrea's empathy meant she genuinely considered Marcus's perspective, even when it contradicted her own felt experience. Her resilience meant she endured more than less durable people would have. Her self-accountability meant she kept assuming that the problem was something inside her to fix. Her competence meant she approached the relationship as a project she could solve if she tried hard enough. Every quality that made her extraordinary in other areas of her life was, inside this relationship, turned into a mechanism of her own confinement. This is not an accident. It is the selection criterion. If you have ever wondered why you seem to attract a particular kind of difficult person, if you have ever noticed that the people in your life who drain you most are often the ones who initially made you feel most seen, most understood, most genuinely valued, this pattern is the answer worth understanding. The ending of Andrea's case, documented in Dr. Holt's 2010 paper in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, arrived not through a dramatic break, but through a medical event. In year 4, Andrea was treated for adrenal fatigue so severe that her physician referred her for psychiatric evaluation as a precaution. The psychiatrist she saw, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, recognized within 2 sessions what had been happening. Not because Andrea described it clearly. She couldn't. She described it in the fragmented, self-doubting language of someone who had spent years having her account of reality edited. Dr. Chen recognized it because she had seen it before across dozens of patients, and because the specific quality of the confusion Andrea presented with, the combination of high external functioning and profound internal disorientation, matched a documented clinical profile. Dr. Chen's subsequent work with Andrea lasted 3 years. In the published case notes, Andrea's first major breakthrough is described as a moment of physical sensation rather than intellectual understanding. She was sitting in session, reviewing a specific incident from year 2 of the relationship, and she said, "I remember feeling certain about what had happened. I remember knowing. And then I remember deciding that my knowing was wrong." That moment, the memory of choosing to override her own perception, was the first time she understood that something had been done to her, not just experienced by her. It was, Dr. Chen wrote, the beginning of her return to herself. If you have ever had the experience of remembering that you once felt certain about something and not being able to find that certainty anymore, not because the evidence changed, but because the experience of trusting yourself changed, that memory deserves your full attention. The case of Andrea is not unusual in its arc. What makes it valuable to study is the precision with which it documents each phase and the intellectual clarity that Dr. Holt and Dr. Chen brought to its analysis. But the pattern it describes has been identified in thousands of documented cases across decades of research in multiple countries, across professional relationships, family structures, friendships, and romantic partnerships, in therapy offices, HR investigations, court records, and the testimony of survivors whose accounts span every demographic category. And in all of that research, one finding reappears with enough consistency to be considered established. The individuals most thoroughly targeted are those with the most developed sense of self, not the least. And the reason is both simpler and more disturbing than most people expect. A well-developed sense of self is both the most valuable thing a narcissistic individual can attack, because undermining it produces profound psychological disruption, and the most renewable source of supply, because a person with genuine psychological substance provides a richer, more complex, more sustaining stream of reaction resistance and eventual capitulation than a person who caves quickly. A person with no real self to erode offers nothing interesting to erode. A person with a rich developed identity is a source of continuous psychological fuel. This is what researchers mean when they describe the narcissistic selection process as predatory, not metaphorically, functionally. The prey that offers the most sustenance is pursued most deliberately. If this kind of deep exploration of the human mind is what you're looking for, subscribing to Mind Cage means you never miss one. What researchers noticed next reveals something most people never see coming when they try to understand why they didn't recognize the signs earlier. There is a phenomenon documented extensively in the literature on coercive control that goes by different names in different research traditions: cognitive dissonance reduction, traumatic bonding, the sunk cost of the self. But that describes the same basic reality. The longer a person has been inside a narcissistic relationship, the harder it is to perceive it accurately, not because their intelligence has diminished, but because their intelligence is being fully deployed in service of a narrative that was designed to be self-reinforcing. Dr. Judith Herman, whose foundational work on trauma and recovery remains essential reading in this field, describes what she calls the double bind of the captive mind. When your sense of what is real has been systematically shaped by someone who benefits from shaping it, the very cognitive tools you use to evaluate reality have been compromised. It is not stupidity. It is a rational adaptation to an environment that has been deliberately made irrational. The mind, doing what minds do, builds a model of the world that works within the constraints of the information it has been given. When that information has been curated to serve someone else's interests, the model it produces serves those interests too. This is why people who exit these relationships frequently describe the experience of clarity as disorienting, because the clarity comes with the retrospective recognition that the model they were using to navigate their own life was built by someone else. The secondary pattern that emerges from the research is about the role of high empathy specifically. Multiple studies have now confirmed what clinicians observe for decades. Individuals who score high on measures of cognitive and affective empathy, the ability both to understand another person's perspective intellectually and to feel it emotionally, are significantly overrepresented in documented cases of narcissistic targeting. Dr. Judith Hall at Northeastern University, whose research on empathic accuracy has been widely cited, suggests that high empathy functions as both an attractant and a vulnerability amplifier. It attracts because narcissistic individuals recognize, often not consciously but functionally, that a highly empathic person will be more likely to extend the benefit of the doubt, more likely to find explanations for difficult behavior, more likely to feel genuine concern for the narcissist's apparent pain or need. It amplifies vulnerability because the empathic person's ability to feel the narcissist's perspective becomes a mechanism through which their own perspective is gradually subordinated. To put this more plainly, if you can feel what another person feels, and a person who wants to control your behavior repeatedly presents their distress, their disappointment, their suffering as a consequence of your actions, your empathy becomes a leash. You do not want to cause pain. You are wired to avoid it. And the person who has learned that they can generate your compliance by generating your guilt has found a control mechanism that costs them almost nothing and costs you almost everything. This is not a reason to become less empathic. Empathy is not a defect. It is one of the most important qualities a human being can have. But understanding how it can be leveraged, how the very responsiveness that makes you a good friend, parent, partner, or colleague can be turned against you, is part of the protection that most people are never given. The third pattern that appears throughout the research concerns the role of high personal standards and self-accountability. Among the qualities that narcissistic individuals identify and exploit, this one is both the most counterintuitive and the most important. The person who holds themselves to a high standard, who believes that their actions and choices reflect on their character, who takes responsibility when things go wrong. This person is, inside a narcissistic relationship, operating at a severe disadvantage. Because when something goes wrong in a relationship where one person refuses accountability and the other person reflexively assumes it, all of the relational burden falls on the person with the high standards. They work harder, they apologize more, they adjust more, they give up more. And the person who never takes responsibility never has to, because the person who always takes responsibility has already absorbed it. Dr. Lundy Bancroft describes this in precise terms in his clinical work with abusive partners. He observed that his clients, abusive men, were not confused about accountability. They did not lack the cognitive capacity to understand cause and effect. They had instead developed a highly functional belief system in which accountability applied to others, not to themselves, and that belief system was most effective when paired with a partner whose accountability beliefs ran in exactly the opposite direction. The resulting dynamic was not a balance, it was an extraction. One person's moral seriousness was being consumed to support another person's moral exemption. If you have ever found yourself in a relationship, romantic, professional, familial, where you worked very hard to understand what you had done wrong, where you made consistent efforts to change and improve and repair, while the other person did none of those things, and where you somehow concluded that the disparity in effort was evidence that you were the problem, That dynamic has a name. It is not love. It is not a bad match. It is a structure, and it was built for someone else's benefit. The fourth pattern is perhaps the most disturbing, and it connects back to why the strongest individuals are not just targeted but specifically sought. It concerns what happens when the target begins to resist, because the strongest people, the ones with the most well-developed sense of self, are also the ones most likely to eventually push back. They have more psychological resources to draw on. They are more likely to begin questioning the narrative. And when they do, this is the turn that catches most people off guard. The narcissistic individual does not retreat. They escalate. The resistance is not read as a boundary. It is read as a challenge, and it intensifies the pursuit. Dr. Kevin Dutton at Oxford, whose research on psychopathic traits in non-clinical populations has been controversial but widely discussed, describes what he calls the conquest dynamic in narcissistic pursuit. The target's resistance, rather than discouraging the narcissist, increases their perceived value. Something that does not resist easily is not worth having. The psychological profile of the narcissistic individual requires a conquest narrative, the story of having won something exceptional. A target who capitulates immediately provides no story. A target who resists and is eventually broken provides the most powerful story of all. This is why the exit from these relationships is frequently so dangerous and so difficult. The ending of the relationship is not read by the narcissistic individual as a conclusion. It is read as a new challenge. The escalation of behavior that many survivors describe after separation, the harassment, the manipulation of shared social networks, the legal and financial warfare, the attempts to recruit mutual contacts, follows the same logic as the original pursuit. What was being sought was not companionship, it was possession. And possession does not end when the object removes itself. For survivors in this phase, this information is not meant to frighten. It is meant to explain why their experience after the relationship ends does not match the narrative that ending a bad relationship produces relief. It produces a new kind of targeted behavior, and understanding that this behavior follows a predictable pattern makes it possible to anticipate and respond to it with strategy rather than shock. Andrea, in the years following her relationship with Marcus, went through a process that Dr. Chen documented carefully because it contained something useful for others. The recovery was not linear. It did not proceed from confusion to clarity in an orderly way. It proceeded in spirals. There were weeks of genuine progress, followed by periods in which the old self-doubt flooded back, and the internal voice that had been Marcus's voice, the one that framed her perceptions as unreliable, her needs as excessive, her emotions as evidence of instability, reasserted itself with a conviction that was terrifying precisely because it felt like her own thought. This is what researchers call the internalized critic, and its presence long after the relationship has ended is one of the most misunderstood aspects of recovery from narcissistic abuse. The person is gone. The relationship is over. The cognitive architecture they built inside the target's mind remains. It continues to operate. It continues to generate the same self-doubt, the same second-guessing, the same tendency to override the evidence of lived experience, with an abstract standard of how a reasonable person would feel, a standard that was never neutral, that was always designed to serve someone else's account of reality. The practical work of dismantling that architecture is slow. It requires, above everything else, the re-establishment of trust in one's own perception, and that is hard work, because the perception was not damaged by a single blow. It was eroded, slowly and consistently, over months and years, by someone who had a deep investment in the erosion. This is why the practical awareness that actually matters is not a list of personality traits to watch for in other people. It is a set of signals about your own internal experience, shifts in how you relate to yourself, that indicate something important is happening before you would otherwise recognize it. The first signal is a change in how you explain yourself. If you find yourself spending significant time preparing explanations for your perfectly ordinary behavior, justifying why you needed what you needed, why you felt what you felt, why your account of an event is accurate, particularly in the context of one specific relationship, something is wrong. Not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily identifiable as abuse in that moment, but wrong. A relationship in which you are consistently required to defend the validity of your own experience is a relationship in which your experience has been placed under contest. And that is a structural problem, not a communication problem. The second signal is selective doubt. If you notice that your confidence in your own perception is solid in every area of your life except in relation to one specific person, if you are calm and clear in professional settings, in friendships, in your own private reflections, but consistently unsure and second-guessing in the context of that one relationship, the most important question you can ask is not what is wrong with me, but whose interests are served by my uncertainty. The third signal is what survivors and researchers both describe as the constant recalibration of normal. When behavior that would have struck you as unacceptable a year ago has become something you accommodate without much thought, it is worth asking not just when that shift happened, but what created the conditions for it. Normalizations do not happen through single events. They happen through the slow accumulation of small adjustments, each one minor enough to absorb, until the cumulative distance from your original sense of what was acceptable is enormous. The fourth signal is the asymmetry of effort. In relationships of all kinds, romantic, professional, familial, effort does not need to be identical. But if you are consistently the person who apologizes, who adjusts, who accommodates, who works to understand the other person's perspective, while the other person consistently does not, the imbalance is not a sign that you are more loving or more mature. It is a sign that a structure has been established in which your effort is expected and their comfort is protected. And that structure needs to be examined. The fifth signal is the loss of access to your own anger. This one is specific and important. Anger in psychologically healthy individuals functions as a signal. It tells you when something has violated your values or your sense of what is fair. People who have been in prolonged contact with narcissistic individuals frequently describe the experience of having lost access to their anger about the relationship while being in it. They could feel sadness, they could feel anxiety, they could feel guilt, but anger, the clean, clarifying anger that says this is not acceptable and I know it, was inaccessible, because anger had been systematically reframed as aggression, as instability, as evidence of the character flaws they were supposed to be working on. When anger is trained out of a person, the signal system that would otherwise alert them to violation is disabled, and without that signal, the violations continue without triggering the appropriate response. Recovery, for Andrea, and for the many people whose cases contribute to this body of research, began in every instance with the same thing, the restoration of a single, small, solid belief in one's own account of one's own experience. Not a complete reconstruction of confidence, not a return to the person they were before, just one moment, one memory, one perception, one feeling that they allowed themselves to trust without editing. And from that single point of restored trust, the broader reconstruction of self became possible. This is why the research consistently identifies the therapeutic relationship, specifically being in the presence of someone who consistently believes your account of your own experience, as so powerful in recovery. It is not about receiving advice. It is about re-experiencing the sensation of being believed, including by yourself. The documented work of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, whose decades of research on trauma and the body produced findings that changed clinical practice across multiple disciplines, includes observations specifically relevant here. His research identified that survivors of prolonged relational trauma, the kind produced by sustained coercive control rather than single traumatic events, frequently experience the most significant healing not through verbal processing alone, but through the re-establishment of what he calls interoceptive trust in the body's signals. Because one of the effects of having your perceptions systematically overridden is that you learn to distrust the physical experience of your own emotions. You feel something in your body, tension, unease, the contraction that comes before tears, and you have been trained to explain it away before you allow it to mean anything. Part of recovery is relearning to let it mean something. If you recognize yourself in any part of what has been described here, if something in this narration has located something in your own experience that you have been carrying without fully understanding, the most important thing to know is this: what happened to you is documented. It is studied. It is understood. It is not a reflection of your weakness, your naivety, or your failure of judgment. It is the predictable result of a sophisticated pattern process applied to a specific kind of person by a specific kind of psychological structure. The intelligence and empathy and strength that made you a target are the same qualities that will allow you to recover from it. If you extend toward yourself even a fraction of the understanding you have so readily extended toward others, and the people around you who have not experienced this, the ones who ask how you didn't see it, who assume that intelligence should have been protection, who wonder aloud how someone as capable as you ended up there, their confusion is understandable. But it is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of how this process works. They believe it targets weakness. Now you know it targets strength. Specifically, precisely, deliberately. The practical protection this knowledge provides is not armor. It is not a guarantee, but it is real. When the mirroring begins, that extraordinary, intoxicating experience of being seen and understood with unusual intensity by someone new, you can notice it without dismissing it and without surrendering to it entirely. When the first reframing appears, the first time your perfectly ordinary perception of reality is gently suggested to be an overreaction, a sensitivity, an excess, you can recognize it as the beginning of a pattern rather than a single comment to be absorbed. When you notice that you are explaining yourself more than the relationship seems to require, you can treat that as information rather than motivation to explain yourself better. When your anger becomes inaccessible in the presence of one specific person, you can ask what it cost you to surrender it, rather than assuming the cost was worth paying. You were not too strong to see it coming. You were exactly strong enough to survive it. And the question that matters now, the one worth sitting with, worth sharing, worth examining in honest conversation, is this: has there been a moment in your life when you chose to override what you knew, when you decided that your own clear perception of something important was wrong, and do you still know what convinced you to make that choice?